When Catherine Wells stood in the dusty saloon of Silver Creek, Montana in 1887, clutching her dying infant son and her last silver dollar, she faced a choice no mother should ever make: watch her baby die of fever while she kept her dignity, or sell the only thing she had left to a stranger for the medicine that could save his life. But the mysterious cattle rancher who answered her desperate plea in that smoke-filled room shocked her by offering something she never expected from any man in the lawless frontier: unconditional mercy that would change not just her fate, but the destiny of an entire town that had forgotten what honor truly meant. Catherine Wells had once been the envy of every woman in Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Married to Deputy Sheriff Marcus Wells, she lived in a neat white house on Elm Street with hand-sewn lace curtains and a vegetable garden that produced the finest tomatoes in 3 counties. Marcus was everything a frontier woman could want: tall, honest, and completely devoted to his family. When their son Samuel was born on a snowy December morning in 1885, their world felt blessed by the Almighty himself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus earned $30 monthly from deputy work, supplemented by weekend blacksmithing, where he shod horses and repaired farm equipment for valley ranchers. Catherine took in sewing from wealthy families, creating beautiful dresses and intricate embroidery work depicting wildflowers and mountain scenes. Her stitches were so fine that wealthy women from Helena traveled to Silver Creek just to commission pieces from her needle. Their combined income allowed small luxuries many frontier families only dreamed of: real coffee beans instead of chicory, store-bought white flour, colorful Chicago fabrics, and even a delicate music box that played Beautiful Dreamer for baby Samuel when he fussed. Catherine had spent 3 months of sewing money on that music box, but Marcus's joy made every penny worthwhile. Their home was a sanctuary of civilization in the wild territory. Catherine had somehow coaxed roses to grow despite Montana's harsh climate, creating a garden paradise where hollyhocks and sweet peas climbed fence posts. Their front porch became a gathering place for neighborhood women, sharing gossip, recipes, and female companionship in a world dominated by rough men and rougher circumstances. On warm summer evenings, Marcus would sit on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands, holding baby Samuel while Catherine mended clothes or worked embroidery. They'd watch sunsets paint the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for reality. Sundays were their most treasured time. They attended services at the small wooden church, Marcus wearing his best charcoal gray suit that Catherine had tailored for his broad shoulders, Catherine in her blue dress with pearl buttons her mother had sent from Philadelphia. Baby Samuel, dressed in his silk christening gown, would sleep peacefully while Reverend Thompson delivered sermons about hope, faith, and the civilizing influence of Christian families on the untamed West. After church, they joined other families for communal dinners where women spread quilts on grass and men discussed politics, weather, and constant rumors of Indian troubles. Catherine was known for her fried chicken and apple pie, recipes from her Ohio grandmother, while Marcus played horseshoes with other men, keeping one eye on his wife and son. The town respected and admired the Wells family. Marcus was known as the fairest lawman in the territory, a man who could diffuse tense situations with calm words before resorting to the Colt 45 on his hip, though everyone knew he was deadly accurate when violence became necessary. He once talked 3 drunk cowboys out of shooting up the general store by buying them coffee and listening to their trail boss complaints. Another time, he prevented a range war between 2 ranchers by suggesting they settle water rights disputes with poker instead of gunfire. Catherine was equally admired for her kindness to newcomers, needle skills, and ability to make any house feel like home with feminine touches. When women faced difficulties, difficult births, sick children, husbands injured in silver mines, Catherine always arrived first with food baskets, willingness to help with housework, and sympathetic ears for troubles that seemed overwhelming. In frontier isolation, their future seemed bright with promise. Marcus talked seriously of running for sheriff when aging Civil War veteran Tom Coleman retired. Catherine dreamed of expanding their house for the large family they both wanted, maybe adding a second story with proper bedrooms and a parlor for receiving sewing customers in style. She'd already started a hope chest, embroidering linens and making baby clothes for brothers and sisters she planned to give Samuel. Evenings found them planning property improvements after Samuel slept in his wooden cradle. Marcus wanted to build a proper blacksmithing workshop, maybe hire an apprentice if business continued growing. Catherine dreamed of a larger garden, perhaps with a greenhouse for year-round flowers. They discussed changes coming to Silver Creek, the railroad that might reach them within 5 years, Montana statehood talk, and steady settler streams turning wilderness into farmland. But the frontier was unforgiving to dreamers, and no amount of planning or prayers could protect against random violence that could shatter lives as easily as bullets shattered glass. Trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late August 1886, when the infamous Garrett brothers rode into Silver Creek like horsemen of the apocalypse. Tom and Jake Garrett were known throughout Montana Territory as ruthless outlaws who had terrorized small towns for 3 years, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and killing anyone who opposed them with casual indifference of men who'd sold their souls to the devil. They'd earned a combined $800 bounty, dead or alive, with wanted posters hanging in every sheriff's office from Billings to Great Falls. The brothers were dangerous contrasts. Tom, the older brother, was a careful planner who studied targets for weeks before striking, learning lawmen routines, building layouts, and townspeople habits. Jake was violent, impulsive, and quick to kill anyone who looked at him wrong. Together, they'd pulled off robberies, leaving 12 men dead and countless families destroyed, operating from mountain caves above Glacier National Park, always one step ahead of the law. Sheriff Coleman was 3 days away tracking horse thieves near the Canadian border, leaving Marcus as senior law enforcement in Silver Creek. The town's only other lawman was Deputy Bill Morrison, a well-meaning but inexperienced young man who'd been on the job 6 weeks and never drawn his gun in anger. When word came that the Garrett brothers were drinking at Murphy's saloon and asking pointed questions about bank operating hours, Marcus knew he had to act immediately. The situation was impossible. Going after the Garrett brothers alone was suicide. They were experienced killers who'd gunned down 3 Colorado lawmen and shown no mercy to anyone opposing them. But waiting for backup wasn't an option. By the time Sheriff Coleman returned or territorial help arrived, the outlaws would have robbed the bank, killed resistors, and disappeared into mountains with enough money for months. Catherine begged him not to go alone when he came home for noon meal and explained the situation. She'd heard Garrett brothers' stories, knew they'd left widows and orphans scattered across 3 territories like broken dolls. Their names alone made strong men cross themselves and check weapons. But Marcus kissed her goodbye with gentle tenderness. That first made her fall in love with him, held baby Samuel one last time, breathing in talcum powder and innocence, and strapped on his gun belt with grim determination of a man understanding duty sometimes demanded ultimate sacrifice. "I'll be back for supper," he promised, adjusting his silver badge and checking his revolver's 6 chambers for fresh cartridges. "Keep the door locked and don't let anyone in except Doc Harrison or Sheriff Coleman. If you hear gunshots, take..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Samuel and hide in the root cellar until everything's quiet. Catherine watched from their front window as Marcus walked down dusty Main Street toward Murphy's saloon, spurs jingling softly with each step, hand resting casually on his gun butt like men who knew how to use such weapons. She saw other townspeople, quickly ducking into buildings and closing shutters, sensing approaching violence that followed the Garrett brothers like storm clouds. Store owners pulled down canvas awnings and bolted doors. Mothers called children inside with sharp, urgent voices. Even stray dogs seemed to sense danger and disappeared into alleys. The usually bustling main street became eerily quiet, with only Marcus's boots echoing off wooden sidewalks and distant laughter from men who didn't yet know death was walking toward them. Catherine pressed her face against cool window glass, breath fogging the pain as she watched her husband's tall figure grow smaller in distance, and prayed to every saint she remembered from childhood catechism. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes destroyed Catherine's entire world as completely as a tornado leveling a house. According to witnesses cowering behind overturned tables and whiskey barrels, Marcus had entered the saloon through swinging doors and calmly identified himself as a law officer. In a voice carrying his badge's authority and his convictions, steel, he asked the Garrett brothers to surrender weapons and come peacefully to jail where they'd await a federal marshal. Tom Garrett's response was to smile like a snake and draw his gun. What followed was a violence ballet, leaving the saloon's mirror shattered, 3 bullet holes in the mahogany bar, and gunpowder smell hanging like funeral incense. Marcus, trained by years of frontier law enforcement and blessed with reflexes that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations, managed to put a bullet through Jake Garrett's heart and wound Tom Garrett in the shoulder before the older brother's return shot found its mark. The bullet that killed Marcus Wells entered through his chest just below his badge, traveled through his lung, and lodged near his heart, tearing through tissue and arteries with hot lead's ruthless efficiency. He lived long enough to see Tom Garrett bleeding on sawdust floor, long enough to know his sacrifice had ended the Garrett brothers' terror reign, long enough for Dr. Harrison to arrive and desperately try saving a life already slipping away. Like water through cupped hands, Dr. Harrison worked frantically to save Marcus, skilled hands moving with practiced urgency of a man who'd tried cheating death countless times on the frontier. He cut away Marcus's shirt, revealing the small, neat hole that seemed too insignificant to be fatal, and probed for the bullet with instruments pitifully inadequate against such massive internal damage. But the damage was too severe, bleeding too profuse, and 1886 medical science was no match for a .45 caliber bullet fired at close range. Marcus Wells died holding Catherine's hand in Murphy's saloon's back room, while autumn wind rattled windows and his blood soaked into rough pine floorboards. His last words, whispered with remaining breath, were promises to watch over her and Samuel from heaven, and a request that she name their next son after him. He was 28 years old, and they'd been married 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, time that seemed both forever and not nearly long enough. Catherine sat beside his still form for 2 hours after he died, holding his hand and memorizing every face detail. How his dark hair curled slightly at temples, the small scar above his left eyebrow from childhood accident, laugh lines around eyes, speaking of a man who'd found joy in simple things. She traced his badge outline with her finger, the silver star that had meant so much to him, and whispered promises to take care of Samuel and make Marcus proud of the man their son would become. The funeral was the largest Silver Creek had ever seen. Marcus had been respected and liked throughout the territory, his death in duty's line making him a local hero whose sacrifice would be remembered long after wooden headboards rotted away. Cowboys rode in from distant ranches, miners came down from hills with hats in hands, and even some Crow Indians from the reservation 20 miles north appeared at cemetery edges to pay respects to a lawman who'd always treated them fairly. Reverend Thompson delivered a eulogy speaking of courage, duty, and the price good men sometimes paid to keep civilization alive in wilderness. The church choir, led by Mrs. Patterson's surprisingly beautiful soprano, sang Amazing Grace and Rock of Ages, while cold wind scattered autumn's last leaves across the newly dug grave. The town council voted unanimously to pay funeral expenses and promised Catherine a monthly widow's pension of $10 as long as she remained in Silver Creek. But promises made in grief's grip often evaporated when faced with frontier economics' harsh realities and people's short memories who had their own problems to worry about. Within weeks of Marcus's burial, Catherine would learn that gratitude was a luxury few could afford for very long. The funeral's immediate aftermath brought sympathy and support floods that made Catherine believe she and Samuel would be cared for by their community. Neighbors brought casseroles, pies, and preserves, filling her pantry to overflowing. Mrs. Richardson organized a collection, raising $47 for Catherine's immediate needs. Church ladies promised to help with babysitting and housework whenever Catherine needed assistance. For a brief, shining moment, Catherine felt embraced by love and support from people understanding Marcus's sacrifice had protected them all, and caring for his widow and child was both Christian duty and practical necessity in a place where everyone depended on everyone else for survival. But as weeks passed and Marcus's death's immediate shock faded into memory, that support began. Crumbling like a house built on sand. Within a month of Marcus's funeral, Catherine's comfortable life began unraveling with avalanche-like frightening speed. The promised widow's pension, when it finally materialized, turned out to be $7 instead of $10. The town council had decided $7 was more realistic given community's limited resources. $7 barely bought flour, beans, and cornmeal for a month, let alone maintained a household, paid mortgage payments, or bought coal needed to heat their house through Montana winter. Without Marcus's $30 monthly salary and weekend blacksmithing income, Catherine couldn't afford the $23 monthly mortgage payment on their house. Her sewing work, which had provided supplemental income of $8 to $12 monthly when Marcus was alive, was now her only real money source. But it wasn't nearly enough to cover expenses, even with the most careful budgeting and strictest economy. The first blow came when Mrs. Richardson, the banker's wife and Catherine's best customer, cancelled her order for 3 elaborate dresses commissioned for the upcoming Christmas social season. The dresses represented 2 weeks of intensive work and would have paid Catherine $15, money she desperately needed for her mortgage payment. Mrs. Richardson's excuse was that she'd decided to order dresses from a Helena dressmaker. Instead, someone with more experience with current fashions. Then Mrs. Patterson, who'd been bringing Catherine regular mending and alteration work, decided she could do her own sewing rather than pay for professional work. Mrs. Foster, who'd commissioned embroidered table linens as her daughter's wedding gift, claimed Catherine's work was taking too long and demanded her deposits return. One by one, Catherine's sewing customers found excuses to take their business elsewhere, as if her widowhood might be contagious and association with her might somehow bring similar tragedy into their own lives. The truth was more complicated and infinitely more cruel than simple superstition. In a frontier town where women were scarce and most men were unmarried or separated from wives left in more civilized places, a young, attractive widow represented a threat to carefully maintained social order. Catherine was only 24 years old, still beautiful despite her grief, and now vulnerable in ways that made other women nervous about their own marriages and relationships. Wives worried their husbands might develop inappropriate ideas about the pretty seamstress who was now alone and needing male protection. Rather than risk temptation or complications that might arise from their husband's gallant impulses, it was simpler and safer to simply avoid Catherine altogether. Let someone else deal with moral complications of helping a woman who might accidentally become more than just charity recipient. Catherine tried desperately to maintain her dignity and household despite growing financial pressure. She sold Marcus's personal belongings piece by piece, his extra clothes, books, shaving kit, spare gun belt, and finally, his beloved pocket watch, a wedding gift from his father that had been in the Wells family for 2 generations. Each sale felt like losing a piece of Marcus all over again, but Samuel needed food and the house needed coal for coming winter. She took in washing, scrubbing other people's clothes by hand in the wooden tub behind her house until her fingers were raw and bleeding from harsh lye soap and constant immersion in cold water. The work was backbreaking and poorly paid, 50 cents for a full washing load that took her an entire day to complete, but it was honest work that didn't require leaving Samuel with strangers. She tried finding work as a cook or cleaner, positions that might pay better than taking in washing, but respectable families wouldn't hire a woman with a baby. They wanted household help who could work long hours without distractions, not someone needing to stop every few hours to feed and tend an infant. Less respectable establishments, saloons, gambling halls, and boarding houses catering to miners and cowboys wouldn't hire the former deputy's wife, partly from respect for Marcus's memory and partly because Catherine's virtue reputation would be bad for their particular business. The house that had once been her pride and joy became a burden she could no longer carry. Mortgage payments fell further and further behind as Catherine chose between heating coal and house payments, between baby food and property taxes. She received official bank notices written in legal language that boiled down to simple threats. Pay what you owe or lose your home. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the medical crisis that would force Catherine to make her life's most desperate choice. Samuel, now 14 months old and walking unsteadily around their cramped room, developed what started as a simple cold, but quickly progressed into something far more serious. His breathing became labored and wheezy. His skin took on frightening grayish pallor, and his tiny body burned with fever that wouldn't break, despite Catherine's desperate attempts to cool him with wet cloths and whispered prayers. Dr. Harrison, the same man who'd tried unsuccessfully to save Marcus, examined Samuel with gentle thoroughness that had made him the most trusted physician in 3 counties. His diagnosis was pneumonia, the same disease that killed more frontier children than Indian raids, mining accidents, and wild animals combined. Without proper treatment, Samuel would likely be dead within a week. "He needs medicine," Dr. Harrison said gravely, writing out a prescription with careful physician's handwriting on expensive paper that seemed to mock Catherine's poverty. "There's a new treatment that's been effective against children's pneumonia, a combination of medicines that can reduce lung inflammation and help him breathe. But I'll have to order it special from Denver, and it's expensive. $25 for the full treatment. $25 might as well have been $25,000. Catherine had exactly $1.67 to her name, hidden in a sock under her mattress, along with Marcus's badge and her wedding ring, the last remnants of her former life. She'd already pawned, sold, or traded everything of value, exhausted every possible income source, and borrowed against her meager widow's pension until she owed more than she could ever hope to repay. She spent 3 desperate days trying to raise the money, swallowing her pride and begging from people who'd once considered her their social equal. She went to the bank, hat in hand, and pleaded with Mr. Richardson for a loan, offering to sign over her future widow's pension, her labor, even her mother's wedding ring as collateral. The banker looked at her with pity and disdain mixture, explaining with infuriating patience that the bank couldn't make loans to people with no assets, no income, and no repayment prospects. She approached the church, hoping Christian charity might provide what business sense couldn't. Reverend Thompson was genuinely sympathetic. even offering to pray with her for Samuel's recovery, but he explained the church's charity fund had been depleted, helping families affected by the silver mine collapse earlier that year. He could offer prayers, moral support, and perhaps a few dollars from his own modest salary, but not the substantial sum Catherine needed to save her son's life. She even swallowed what remained of her pride and approached some of the wealthier women in town, the same ladies who'd once competed for her sewing services and invited her to tea parties and social gatherings. Their responses revealed ugly truths about frontier charity and Christian compassion's limits when it came to practical help. Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely uncomfortable and claimed her husband controlled all their money and wouldn't approve of lending to someone in Catherine's circumstances. Mrs. Richardson, the banker's wife, mentioned vaguely that times were hard for everyone, and suggested perhaps Catherine should consider placing Samuel with a family that could better provide for him, as if giving up her child was a reasonable solution to temporary financial crisis. Each rejection felt like a physical blow, leaving Catherine more desperate and isolated than before. These were women she'd helped during their own troubled times, women whose children she'd sewn clothes for when they were too busy or proud to do the work themselves, whose houses she'd helped clean when they were ill, whose confidence she'd kept when they shared fears about marriages, children, or uncertain frontier futures. By the fourth day, Samuel's condition had worsened dramatically. His breathing was so labored, Catherine could see his tiny ribs straining through his skin with each struggling breath, and the sound of his efforts filled their small room like a broken bellows wheeze. His fever had climbed so high, he barely responded to her voice or touch, lying limply in his makeshift crib like a broken doll whose spirit was slowly leaving its fragile shell. Dr. Harrison's expression grew more grave with each visit, and Catherine could see in his experienced eyes the professional assessment that her son was dying. Time was running out with clock-like relentless inevitability ticking toward midnight, and she'd exhausted every respectable option for raising money that could save Samuel's life. That evening, as Catherine sat beside Samuel's crib, listening to his tortured breathing and feeling his fever's heat radiating through thin blankets, she realized she had only one option left. It was an option that went against everything she'd been taught about respectability, morality, and proper lady behavior. It was an option that would destroy her reputation, possibly her soul, and certainly any chance of rebuilding the respectable life she'd lost when Marcus died. But as she watched her son struggle for each precious breath, Catherine understood with crystalline clarity that some things mattered more than reputation, more than social standing, more than opinions of people who'd already abandoned her in her greatest need time. Samuel's life was worth any sacrifice, any humiliation, any price she might have to pay. She'd heard whispers about women who sold themselves to men for money. It was the kind of thing respectable people didn't discuss openly, but everyone knew it happened in frontier towns full of lonely miners, cowboys, and drifters who had money to spend and few questions about where it went. Catherine had always felt sorry for such women, had assumed they were driven to such desperate measures by moral weakness, lack of proper upbringing, or absence of Christian values. Now she understood with devastating clarity that sometimes desperation erased the luxury of moral judgments, and survival could force even the most virtuous woman to make choices that would have been unthinkable in better circumstances. Samuel needed medicine, and she'd exhausted every respectable avenue for obtaining it. If selling herself was the only way to save her son's life, then that was what she would do, regardless of cost to her soul or future. She put on her best remaining dress, the black wool she'd worn to Marcus's funeral, and walked through the cold November night toward Murphy's saloon, where she knew she'd find men with money in their pockets and few questions about how they spent it. Her hands shook as she approached the familiar swinging doors, and the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies hit her like a physical force when she pushed them open. The saloon fell silent as she entered, every conversation stopping mid-sentence, as 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the impossible sight of Catherine Wells, the respected deputy's widow, standing in the doorway of Silver Creek's roughest establishment. But desperation had brought her to this moment, and desperation would give her courage to do what needed to be done. Samuel's life depended on it, and nothing else mattered anymore. The saloon's silence stretched like a taut rope as Catherine stood, frozen in the doorway, 20 pairs of eyes studying her like she was a ghost, materialized from their worst nightmares. The piano player's hands hovered motionless above the keys, cards remained suspended mid-deal, and even the bartender stopped polishing his glass to stare at the impossible sight before them. Murphy's saloon was exactly what Catherine had expected, a den of vice that reeked of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and spilled whiskey. Sawdust covered the floor to absorb blood and other unspeakable fluids, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows that made the rough faces of miners and cowboys look even more sinister. A faded painting of a half-naked woman hung crookedly behind. The bar and the walls were riddled with bullet holes that told stories of violence and death. Catherine's black funeral dress marked her as dramatically out of place among the leather chaps, dirty work shirts, and gun belts that filled the room. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the lamplight, and her dark hair, though no longer perfectly styled, still carried traces of the refinement that had once made her the most beautiful woman in Silver Creek. But it was her eyes that drew the most attention, eyes filled with such desperate determination that even hardened men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered a grizzled prospector near the bar, his voice barely audible above the crackling fireplace. "That's Marcus Wells's widow." The whisper rippled through the room like wildfire, and Catherine watched as recognition dawned on face after weathered face. Some men looked away in embarrassment, others leered with sudden interest, and a few seemed genuinely concerned about what could have driven the respected deputy's wife to enter such a place. Catherine's hands trembled as she clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but she forced herself to take another step into the room. The floorboards creaked under her worn boots, and she could feel the weight of every stair pressing down on her like a physical force. Her heart hammered so violently she was certain everyone could hear it, but Samuel's labored breathing echoed in her memory, giving her strength to continue. "I need to speak with someone," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. "Someone who might be willing to help a woman in desperate circumstances." The piano player, a thin man with greasy hair and tobacco-stained teeth, let out a low chuckle. "I bet you do, sweetheart. Question is, what kind of help you looking for?" Several men laughed at this crude suggestion, but their laughter had an uncomfortable edge to it. Even in a place like Murphy's saloon, there were unwritten rules about how to treat a widow, especially one whose husband had died protecting their town. Catherine's presence here violated every social convention they knew, creating a tension that none of them quite knew how to handle. "Shut your mouth, Jenkins," growled a voice from the far corner of the room. "Show some respect." Catherine turned toward the voice and saw a man she didn't recognize sitting alone at a small table in the shadows. He was older than most of the other patrons, perhaps 40, with graying hair and clothes that, while dusty from travel, were clearly of better quality than the typical frontier wear. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held an intelligence and gravity that set him apart from the rough crowd surrounding him. The man stood slowly, his movement causing the other patrons to shift their attention from Catherine to him. He was tall, probably 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical strength, but he carried himself with the measured grace of someone accustomed to command. A gun hung at his hip, worn low and tied down in the manner of a man who knew how to use it, but everything else about him suggested education and refinement. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "my name is Jonathan Whitmore. I couldn't help but overhear your request, and I'm wondering if perhaps we might speak privately about your circumstances." Catherine stared at him, trying to process this unexpected development. She had expected to negotiate with rough miners or drunken cowboys, men who would see her as nothing more than a commodity to be purchased and used. Jonathan Whitmore was something entirely different, a gentleman whose very presence seemed to command respect, even in this lawless environment. "I don't know if you understand what I'm asking," Catherine said carefully, her cheeks burning with shame at having to spell out her intentions. "I'm not here for conversation, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here because I need money, and I have only one thing left to sell." The bluntness of her words sent another ripple of tension through the room. Some men leaned forward with predatory interest, while others looked genuinely uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Jonathan Whitmore's expression remained unchanged, but Catherine thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, not lust or amusement, but something that looked almost like pain. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Wells," he replied quietly, "and I believe we should definitely discuss your situation. Perhaps we could step outside where we might have more privacy." "Now hold on just a minute," interrupted a burly man with arms like tree trunks and a face scarred by years of mining accidents. "If the lady's here for business, seems like we all ought to have a chance to make an offer. Fair's fair." Several other men voiced their agreement, and Catherine felt a wave of panic wash over her as she realized how quickly the situation could spiral out of control. She had imagined a simple transaction, money in exchange for her body, but she hadn't considered the possibility of multiple buyers or an auction-like atmosphere that would make her feel even more degraded than she already did. "The lady has already accepted my offer," Jonathan said calmly, but there was steel in his voice that cut through the growing murmur of dissent. "And I'd suggest that any gentleman here would respect that arrangement." "What offer?" demanded the scarred miner. "I didn't hear no offer made, and I got silver dust says I can pay better than some traveling cattle buyer." "Cattle rancher," Jonathan corrected mildly, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "And I assure you, money won't be an issue." Catherine watched this exchange with growing alarm. She had come here to sacrifice her dignity for Samuel's medicine, but she hadn't anticipated starting a fight that could end with someone getting killed. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and she could see several men positioning themselves for trouble. "Please," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the brewing confrontation. "I don't want any violence. Mr. Whitmore, if you're serious about helping me, then yes, let's speak outside." Jonathan nodded and gestured toward the door, but the scarred miner wasn't finished. "This ain't right," he complained. "Rich man comes in here and thinks he can just take whatever he wants because he's got fancy clothes and smooth talk. Some of us been drinking here all evening, and we deserve consideration too." "What you deserve," said a new voice from near the bar, "is a lesson in manners." Catherine turned to see who had spoken and found herself looking at a man she recognized. Frank Morrison, the elder brother of Deputy Bill Morrison. Frank was a successful merchant who owned the largest general store in Silver Creek, and his presence in Murphy's saloon was almost as surprising as her own. He was normally found in more respectable establishments, conducting business over meals at the hotel restaurant rather than drinks in a frontier saloon. "Frank," Catherine said, her voice filled with confusion and embarrassment, "what are you doing here?" Frank Morrison's face reddened as he realized he'd drawn attention to himself. He was a married man with a reputation to maintain, and being seen in Murphy's saloon could damage his standing in the community almost as much as Catherine's presence here would damage hers. "Business meeting," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely toward a table where two rough-looking men sat with ledgers and sample bags that suggested some kind of mining transaction. "Nothing that concerns anyone else." The awkwardness of the situation seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Here were two respectable members of Silver Creek society, both caught in a place they shouldn't be, both probably wishing they could disappear rather than explain their presence. The irony wasn't lost on the saloon's regular patrons, several of whom began chuckling at the uncomfortable reunion. "Well, well," said the piano player with malicious glee. "Looks like Murphy's is becoming quite the social gathering tonight. Maybe we should start charging admission to watch the respectable folks slum with the rest of us." "That's enough, Jenkins," Jonathan said sharply. "Mrs. Wells, shall we continue this conversation outside?" Catherine nodded gratefully and turned toward the door. But before she could take a step, the scarred miner stood up and blocked her path. Up close, he was even more intimidating than he had appeared from across the room. He smelled of sweat, alcohol, and the metallic tang of silver ore, and his small eyes glittered with a combination of lust and malice that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Not so fast, lady," he said, his voice slurred, but his intention clear. "Maybe I can't outbid Fancy Boy over there, but I got a right to hear what you're asking before you go making deals in private." Catherine could smell his breath, rank with whiskey and rotting teeth, as he leaned closer to her. She tried to step back, but found herself pressed against the doorframe with nowhere to retreat. The miner's hand moved toward her arm, and she knew that in another moment this would escalate beyond her ability to control. "Touch her and you'll lose that hand," Jonathan said quietly, but his voice carried such deadly certainty that the miner froze mid-reach. The entire saloon went silent. Again, but this time it was the silence of men who recognized mortal danger when they heard it. Jonathan hadn't moved from his position near the corner table, hadn't even touched his gun, but something in his tone convinced everyone present that he meant exactly what he said and had the skill to back it up. The scarred miner slowly lowered. His hand, his alcohol-addled brain, apparently still functioning well enough to recognize a superior threat when he encountered one. "Ain't no call for violence," he muttered, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "Just wanted to make sure the lady was being treated fair." "She will be," Jonathan assured him. "Mrs. Wells, after you." Catherine hurried through the door and into the cold November night, grateful to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the saloon, but uncertain what awaited her outside. The temperature had dropped significantly since she'd entered Murphy's, and her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Above them, stars glittered like ice crystals against the black Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled mournfully. Jonathan followed her outside and carefully closed the saloon door behind him, muffling the sounds of conversation and piano music that had resumed inside. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence on the wooden sidewalk, neither quite sure how to begin the conversation that had brought them together. "Mrs. Wells," Jonathan said finally, his voice gentle but serious. "Before we discuss anything else, I need to know what's driven you to such desperate measures. What could possibly be so urgent that you'd risk your reputation and safety in a place like that?" The kindness in his tone nearly broke Catherine's carefully maintained composure. She had been prepared for crude propositions, haggling over prices, and the cold transaction of selling her body like livestock. She hadn't been prepared for genuine concern or the suggestion that her circumstances mattered more than her availability. "My son," she said simply, and then the words began pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. She told him about Samuel's pneumonia, about Dr. Harrison's diagnosis and the $25 cost of the medicine that could save her boy's life. She explained about the widow's pension that wasn't enough, the sewing customers who'd abandoned her, and the foreclosure that had left them living in a tiny room above Chen's general store. As she spoke, she watched Jonathan's face in the dim light spilling from the saloon windows. His expression remained grave and attentive, showing none of the boredom or impatience she might have expected from a man who had come here for physical gratification rather than a widow's sob story. $25, he repeated when she finished her recitation. And how much time do you have? Dr. Harrison says Samuel will be dead within a week without the medicine, Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper, maybe less. He's getting worse every day. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering her situation. Catherine used the silence to study him more carefully, trying to understand what kind of man she was dealing with. His clothes, while dusty from travel, were well made and expensive. His boots were hand-tooled leather that probably cost more than most men in Silver Creek made in a month. The gun at his hip was a Colt .45 with ivory grips, and she could see the glint of a gold watch chain across his vest. Everything about him suggested wealth and success, which made his presence in Murphy's saloon all the more puzzling. Men like Jonathan Whitmore usually stayed at the hotel when they visited frontier towns, conducting their business in respectable establishments rather than gambling halls and saloons. His presence here suggested either unusual tastes or unusual circumstances. Mr. Whitmore, Catherine said hesitantly, I should ask what you were doing in that saloon. I mean, you don't seem like the typical customer. A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment he looked older than his years. I was looking for someone, he said quietly, someone who's been avoiding me for the better part of 2 years. But that's my concern, not yours. And now, Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer, what do you want from me? Jonathan reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. In the dim light, Catherine could see that it was thick with bills, more money than she had seen in one place since Marcus died. Her heart began beating faster as she realized that her salvation might be within reach, even if it came at the cost of everything she had been raised to value. Mrs. Wells, Jonathan said carefully, I want you to understand something before we go any further. What you're proposing to do tonight will change you in ways you can't imagine. Once you cross that line, you can never go back to being the woman you were before. Are you absolutely certain this is the only option available to you? The question surprised Catherine. She had expected him to negotiate terms and prices, not to question her decision or offer her an opportunity to reconsider. His concern seemed genuine, which made her current situation even more surreal. I've tried everything else, she said firmly. I've begged, borrowed, and sold everything I own. I've approached the bank, the church, and every wealthy family in town. No one will help me, and Samuel is dying. If this is what it takes to save my son's life, then yes, I'm certain. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. In that case, he said, I have a proposition for you, but it's not what you're expecting, and it's not what brought you to Murphy's saloon tonight. Catherine stared at him, confusion replacing the resignation she had felt moments before. I don't understand. $25, Jonathan said, opening his wallet and counting out the bills. For the medicine your son needs. No strings attached, no payment required, no obligations on your part whatsoever. Catherine watched in stunned silence as he counted out the money and held it toward her. The bills seemed to glow in the starlight, representing not just Samuel's salvation, but her own deliverance from the degradation she had been prepared to endure. But the offer seemed too good to be true, and her frontier upbringing had taught her to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. That's not possible, she said, making no move to take the money. No one gives away $25 for nothing. What do you really want? Nothing, Jonathan replied simply. Sometimes people help other people because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return. But why? Catherine pressed. You don't know me, you don't owe me anything, and I came to that saloon prepared to sell myself to the highest bidder. Why would you help someone like me? Jonathan was quiet for so long that Catherine began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her heart ache in sympathy. Because 3 years ago, I had a son, he said quietly. Robert was his name. He was about the same age as your Samuel when he got sick with scarlet fever. I had all the money in the world, the best doctors that could be brought in from Denver and San Francisco, every possible medical treatment available. But none of it mattered. Robert died anyway, and my wife Elizabeth followed him 3 months later, unable to live with the grief. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes as she began to understand the source of Jonathan's unexpected kindness. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I couldn't save my own son, Jonathan continued, but maybe I can save yours. Maybe that's worth something in the grand scheme of things. But $25, Catherine protested weakly, even as hope began, blooming in her chest like a flower after rain. That's a fortune to someone like me. It's nothing to someone like me, Jonathan replied matter-of-factly. I own cattle ranches in 3 states and more land than I could ride across in a week. $25 is what I spend on a good dinner when I'm in Denver, but for you, it means your son lives to see another Christmas. Catherine stared at the money in his outstretched hand, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare might be ending without the sacrifice she had been prepared to make. I don't know what to say. Say thank you and take the money, Jonathan suggested, gently. Then go to Dr. Harrison and buy your son's medicine. That's all I want from you, Mrs. Wells. Nothing more, nothing less. With trembling hands, Catherine reached out and took the bills. They felt real enough, crisp and new, with the distinctive texture of genuine currency rather than the worthless scrip that sometimes circulated in frontier towns. $25, more than enough to buy Samuel's medicine, and perhaps even enough left over to pay for their room for another month. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of his gift. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, Jonathan said. Just take care of your son and try to build a better life for both of you. That's payment enough. Catherine clutched the money to her chest and felt tears streaming down her face. For the first time since Marcus died, they were tears of joy rather than despair. Samuel would live, her son would survive this crisis, and she wouldn't have to destroy herself to save him. There is one thing, Jonathan said hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure he should continue. Catherine's heart sank. She had known the offer was too good to be true. What? I'll be in Silver Creek for a few more days, conducting some business with local ranchers. If you'd like, I'd be honored to call on you and check on your son's progress. Not for any improper reasons, he added quickly, but because I'd like to know that my money helped and that Samuel is recovering. The request was so reasonable, so genuinely caring, that Catherine felt ashamed for her momentary suspicion. Of course, she said. I'd welcome the visit. We're staying in the room above Chen's general store. I know, Jonathan said with a slight smile. News travels fast in a town this size, especially when it concerns the deputy's widow. I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon if that's acceptable. Catherine nodded, still hardly able to believe her good fortune. Mr. Whitmore, you've saved my son's life tonight. I'll never forget your kindness. And I'll never forget your courage, Jonathan replied. It takes tremendous bravery to do what you were prepared to do for your child. I hope you never have to face such desperation again. As Catherine hurried through the cold night toward Dr. Harrison's house, clutching the money that would save Samuel's life, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Jonathan Whitmore was about more than just a wealthy man's charity. There had been something in his eyes, some deep loneliness that matched her own, that suggested their paths might cross again in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Behind her, the sounds of Murphy's saloon continued, piano music, laughter, and the clink of glasses. But those sounds seemed to come from another world now, a world where desperate women sold themselves for their children's lives and decent men were as rare as diamonds in the rough Montana soil. Tonight, she had discovered that such men did exist and that knowledge changed everything. Dr. Harrison answered his door on the third knock, wearing a rumpled nightshirt and carrying a medical bag that suggested he had been expecting an emergency call. His weathered face showed surprise when he saw Catherine standing on his doorstep at nearly midnight, clutching $25 in currency that seemed to materialize from thin air. "Mrs. Wells, what brings you out at this hour? Has Samuel taken a turn for the worse?" "No, Doctor," Catherine said breathlessly, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. "I have the money, all of it, $25 for Samuel's medicine." Dr. Harrison studied the bills she thrust toward him with the skeptical eye of a man who had seen too many desperate situations end in disappointment. In frontier towns, money promised was often money that vanished by morning, and he had learned to be cautious about celebrations that might prove premature. "Where did you get this, Catherine?" he asked gently, using her first name in the familiar way of someone who had delivered her child and held her hand during Marcus's final moments. "This morning you had barely enough for bread." Catherine's cheeks burned as she realized she would have to explain how she had acquired the money without revealing the desperate measures she had been prepared to take. The truth about her visit to Murphy's saloon would destroy what remained of her reputation, but a lie felt like betraying Jonathan Whitmore's extraordinary generosity. "A benefactor," she said finally, settling on a compromise that was technically accurate. "Someone who heard about Samuel's condition and wanted to help." Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, but didn't press for details. In his long career, he had learned that sometimes the source of miracles mattered less than their occurrence, and desperate mothers often found help in unexpected places. "Very well," he said, pocketing the money and reaching for his coat. "I'll send the telegram to Denver first thing in the morning. The medicine should arrive on Thursday's stage, and we can begin Samuel's treatment immediately." "Thursday?" Catherine's heart sank. "But that's 3 days away. Will Samuel... Can he wait that long?" Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave as he considered the question. "We'll do everything we can to keep him comfortable until then. Cool baths for the fever, steam treatments for his breathing, and constant monitoring. The next 3 days will be critical, but if Samuel can hold on until Thursday, the medicine should turn things around quickly." Catherine nodded, trying to hide her anxiety behind a mask of maternal confidence. 3 more days of watching her son struggle for every breath, 3 more nights of sitting beside his crib, wondering if each labored inhalation might be his last. But at least now there was hope, real hope, backed by real medicine and real money. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "For everything." As Catherine walked back through Silver Creek's dark streets toward Chen's general store, she found herself thinking about Jonathan Whitmore and the mysterious circumstances that had brought him to Murphy's saloon at exactly the moment she needed him most. His explanation about looking for someone who had been avoiding him raised more questions than it answered, but Catherine was too grateful for his intervention to pry into his private business. The next morning brought the first sign that Samuel's condition might be stabilizing. When Catherine woke from her fitful sleep in the chair beside his crib, she found her son's fever had broken slightly, and his breathing seemed marginally easier. It wasn't dramatic improvement, but after weeks of watching him grow steadily worse, any positive change felt like a miracle. Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese woman who helped run the general store below their room, knocked softly on their door. Around mid-morning, with a bowl of rice porridge and herbal tea that she claimed would help with respiratory ailments. "Ancient Chinese remedy," she explained in her careful English, setting the steaming bowl on Catherine's small table. "My grandmother used for sick children in old country. Maybe help little Samuel, yes?" Catherine accepted the offering gratefully, touched by kindness from someone who barely knew her, but had apparently been listening to Samuel's nighttime coughing through the thin walls. Mrs. Chen had never been particularly friendly before, maintaining the polite distance that characterized most interactions between Chinese immigrants and white settlers in frontier towns. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. This is very thoughtful." The older woman studied Samuel with the practiced eye of someone who had raised many children through serious illnesses. "Fever breaking, yes? Good sign. Medicine come soon?" "Thursday," Catherine replied, wondering how Mrs. Chen knew about the expected medicine delivery. "Dr. Harrison ordered it from Denver." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Denver doctors know good medicine. Thursday not so far. We help you wait, yes? Mr. Chen and me, we know about sick children. We lost 2 sons to mountain fever many years ago." The admission caught Catherine by surprise. In the 18 months she had lived above their store, neither Mr. nor Mrs. Chen had mentioned having children, let alone losing them to illness. The revelation created an instant bond between the two women, united by the universal fear of mothers watching their children suffer. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Catherine said softly. "It must have been terrible. Very terrible," Mrs. Chen agreed matter-of-factly. "But also long time ago. Now we help other mothers when we can. Is good for healing, yes?" That afternoon, as promised, Jonathan Whitmore arrived to check on Samuel's progress. Catherine had spent the morning cleaning their tiny room and herself, as thoroughly as possible, wanting to present a respectable appearance for the man who had saved her son's life. She'd even managed to wash and properly arrange her hair, restoring some of the dignity that had been stripped away by months of poverty and desperation. Jonathan knocked politely on the door that led from the store's back stairs to their room, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He had changed from the travel-stained clothes he'd worn the previous night into a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that emphasized his tall, strong frame. "Mrs. Wells," he said, removing his hat as she opened the door. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to see how Samuel was feeling today." "Please come in," Catherine said, stepping aside to let him enter their modest accommodations. She watched his eyes take in the sparse furnishings, the clothes hanging on pegs along one wall, and the makeshift crib where Samuel lay sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. If Jonathan was shocked by the obvious poverty of their circumstances, he hid it well. His expression remained neutral and respectful as he approached Samuel's crib and observed the child's slightly improved breathing. "He looks better," Jonathan observed quietly. "More color in his cheeks, and his breathing seems easier." "Dr. Harrison thinks the crisis may be passing," Catherine replied, unable to keep the relief out of her voice. "The medicine should arrive Thursday, and then we can begin proper treatment." Jonathan nodded and held out the package he had brought. "I thought Samuel might enjoy this when he's feeling better. Nothing elaborate, just something to help pass the time during his recovery." Catherine unwrapped the package to discover a beautiful wooden toy horse, intricately carved and painted with remarkable attention to detail. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master woodcarver, and it must have cost more than Catherine spent on food in a month. "Mr. Whitmore, this is too much," she protested, even as she admired the toy's artistry. "You've already been so generous." "Every boy should have a horse," Jonathan replied with a slight smile. "Even if it's only a wooden one. I bought it from a German craftsman in Denver who specializes in children's toys. He assured me it would survive even the most enthusiastic play." Catherine set the horse on the table where Samuel would see it when he woke, and turned back to her unexpected benefactor. "Would you like some coffee? It's not very good coffee, but it's hot." "I'd be grateful for anything you have," Jonathan replied, settling into the room's only chair, while Catherine busied herself with the coffee pot. As she prepared their modest refreshments, Catherine found herself stealing glances at Jonathan and trying to understand what motivated his continued kindness. He could have given her the money and disappeared, satisfied with his good deed and never thinking about her again. Instead, he had returned to check on Samuel's progress and brought an expensive gift for a child he barely knew. "Mr. Whitmore," she said as she handed him a cup of the weak coffee, "may I ask what business brings you to Silver Creek? You mentioned cattle ranching, but we're not exactly a major livestock center." Jonathan accepted the coffee gratefully and considered his answer carefully. "I'm looking into acquiring grazing rights for some of the rangeland north of town," he said finally. "There's also a mining operation that might be worth investing in, and I'm always interested in opportunities to expand into new territories." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. Catherine remembered his comment the previous night about looking for someone who had been avoiding him, and she wondered if his business interests were merely a convenient excuse for a more personal mission. "Have you been successful in your endeavors?" she asked politely. "Mixed results," Jonathan replied diplomatically. "Some people are eager to do business, others are more resistant to change, but I'm a patient man when necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by Samuel stirring in his crib and beginning to fuss softly. Catherine immediately went to him, lifting him gently and checking his temperature with her hand against his forehead. The fever was definitely lower than it had been in days, though still present enough to make him uncomfortable. "Mama," Samuel whispered, the first word he had spoken clearly in over a week. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes at the sound of her son's voice, stronger and more alert than it had been since his illness began. "I'm here, sweetheart. Mama's here." Samuel's gaze wandered around the room and settled on Jonathan, studying the stranger with the frank curiosity of a young child. "Who dat?" "This is Mr. Whitmore," Catherine explained softly. "He's a friend who brought you a present." She carried Samuel to the table and showed him the wooden horse, watching his eyes widen with delight at the beautiful toy. Even in his weakened state, he reached out to touch the carved mane and painted saddle, making soft sounds of appreciation. "Horse," Samuel said clearly, demonstrating that his recovery was progressing well. "That's right," Jonathan said, his voice unusually gentle. "He's a very special horse who will take good care of you while you get better." Catherine watched the interaction between Jonathan and her son with growing amazement. The wealthy rancher who commanded respect in saloons and business meetings transformed into something entirely different when speaking to a sick child. His voice became softer, his movements more careful, and his entire demeanor radiated the kind of patient kindness that suggested extensive experience with young children. "You mentioned having a son," Catherine said quietly, settling Samuel back in his crib with the wooden horse within reach. He must have been about Samuel's age. Pain flickered across Jonathan's features before he could hide it. "Robert was 15 months when he died," he said simply. "Old enough to have his own personality, his own little ways of doing things. Samuel reminds me of him in some ways." "Is that why you're helping us?" Catherine asked gently. "Because we remind you of your family." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't fully formed. "Perhaps," he admitted finally, "or perhaps I'm helping because it's the right thing to do, and I'm in a position to make a difference. Does the motivation matter if the result is good?" "I suppose not," Catherine replied, though she found herself increasingly curious about the man who had appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. But I can't help wondering about someone who gives away $25 to a stranger and asks nothing in return. Maybe I'm getting something in return, Jonathan suggested. Maybe watching Samuel recover will help heal something in me that's been broken for a long time. The honesty of his admission caught Catherine off guard. She had assumed his generosity was purely altruistic, motivated by memories of his own loss and a desire to prevent another family from suffering as his had. But his words suggested a more complex motivation, as if helping Samuel might somehow help him process his own grief. "You lost more than your son, didn't you?" Catherine said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. "You lost your whole family." "Elizabeth couldn't live with Robert's death," Jonathan confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She blamed herself, blamed me, blamed God. 3 months after we buried Robert, I found her in our bedroom with an empty bottle of laudanum and a note asking for forgiveness." Catherine felt her heart ache for this man who had suffered losses that made her own troubles seem manageable by comparison. She had lost her husband, but she still had Samuel. Jonathan had lost everything that mattered to him, and somehow found the strength to go on living and even helping others. "I'm so sorry," she said inadequately. "I can't imagine that kind of pain." "The strange thing is," Jonathan continued, "I thought helping you might make me feel better about failing to save my own family. But what I've discovered is that it's not about me at all. It's about Samuel and about you, and about the simple fact that sometimes people need help, and other people are in a position to provide it." Samuel had fallen asleep again, clutching his wooden horse, and the sight of the peaceful child seemed to bring Jonathan some measure of comfort. Catherine watched him study her son's face and wondered what memories the scene evoked for him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said hesitantly, "you mentioned yesterday that you'll be in Silver Creek for a few more days. If you'd like, you're welcome to visit Samuel again. I think he enjoyed meeting you, and it would be nice for him to have visitors during his recovery." "I'd like that very much," Jonathan replied, and Catherine could see that he meant it. "I'll try not to impose too frequently, but I confess I'm invested in Samuel's recovery now." "You wouldn't be imposing," Catherine assured him. "We don't have many visitors these days, and Samuel needs all the friendship he can get." As Jonathan prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to Catherine with an expression of mild concern. "Mrs. Wells, I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you managing all right otherwise? I mean, beyond Samuel's medical needs. Do you have enough food, adequate coal for heating, that sort of thing?" Catherine's pride warred with her practical needs as she considered how to answer. The truth was that even with Samuel's medicine secured, she was still desperately poor and struggling to meet their basic daily requirements. But accepting more charity from Jonathan felt like taking advantage of his kindness. "We're managing," she said diplomatically, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Jonathan studied her face with the same careful attention he had given Samuel's condition, and Catherine suspected he saw through her diplomatic answer. "I see," he said thoughtfully. "Well, if circumstances change, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be staying at the hotel through the weekend." After he left, Catherine found herself thinking about their conversation and the glimpses he had given her into his personal tragedy. She had approached Jonathan as a desperate woman, seeking to sell her body for her child's medicine. But what she had discovered was a man as wounded and lonely as she was, searching for ways to find meaning in a life that had been stripped of everything that once gave it purpose. The wooden horse Samuel clutched in his sleep was beautiful and expensive, but Catherine suspected it represented something more valuable than its monetary worth. It was a bridge between Jonathan's lost past and his uncertain future, a way of honoring his dead son by caring for someone else's living child. Thursday morning arrived grey and cold, with the promise of snow in the air and tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Catherine woke early and dressed carefully, wanting to look presentable when she accompanied Dr. Harrison to meet the Denver stage that would bring Samuel's medicine. Samuel seemed notably improved, sitting up in his crib and playing with his wooden horse, while babbling in the mixed English and nonsense syllables that characterized recovering toddlers. His fever was almost completely gone, and his breathing, while still slightly labored, was dramatically better than it had been just a few days earlier. Dr. Harrison arrived at the general store just as the stage was pulling into town, its 6 horses lathered with sweat from their hard run across the mountain passes. Catherine watched anxiously as the driver and passengers disembarked, followed by the careful unloading of mail bags, packages, and freight that connected Silver Creek to the wider world. "Package for Dr. Harrison," called the stage driver, holding up a small wooden crate marked with official medical symbols. "Special delivery from Denver General Hospital." Dr. Harrison signed for the package and immediately opened it to inspect the contents. Inside, packed in sawdust and straw, were 6 small glass bottles filled with clear liquid that looked disappointingly ordinary for something that had cost $25. "This is it," Dr. Harrison said with satisfaction. "Latest treatment for respiratory infections. 1 dose every 4 hours until the bottles are empty. If this doesn't clear up Samuel's pneumonia, nothing will." Catherine held her breath as Dr. Harrison prepared the first dose, carefully measuring the clear liquid into a small spoon. Samuel accepted the medicine without protest, making a face at the bitter taste but swallowing obediently when his mother encouraged him. "How long before we know if it's working?" Catherine asked anxiously. "We should see improvement within 24 hours, Dr. Harrison replied. "If the medicine is going to be effective, Samuel's breathing should become noticeably easier by tomorrow morning." As they walked back toward the general store, Catherine noticed a crowd gathered around the hotel across the street. People were talking in excited whispers and pointing toward the building's upper windows, behavior that suggested some significant event had occurred. "What do you suppose that's about?" she asked Dr. Harrison. The doctor squinted toward the hotel and frowned. "I'm not sure, but it looks like they're discussing something serious. Why don't you get Samuel settled with his medicine, and I'll see what's happening." Catherine climbed the stairs to their room, her mind focused entirely on Samuel's treatment schedule and the hopeful possibility that her son's recovery was finally beginning. She had no way of knowing that the excitement at the hotel involved Jonathan Whitmore and a confrontation that would soon change the course of all their lives. As she settled Samuel for his afternoon nap, Catherine found herself thinking about Jonathan's promise to visit again and wondering if his business dealings were proceeding smoothly. Something told her that his affairs in Silver Creek were more complicated than simple cattle purchases and mining investments, and she hoped that whatever had brought him to their town wouldn't interfere with the friendship that seemed to be developing between them. Samuel drifted off to sleep, holding his wooden horse, his breathing easier than it had been in weeks, and Catherine allowed herself to believe that the worst might finally be over. But in frontier towns, trouble had a way of finding people just when they thought they were safe, and the crowd gathered outside the hotel was discussing events that would soon test every relationship Catherine had formed since Marcus's death. Tiki. Commotion outside the hotel reached Catherine's ears as angry voices and the sound of shattering glass cut through the afternoon stillness. She had just finished giving Samuel his second dose of medicine when Dr. Harrison burst through her door without knocking, his face pale with urgency. "Catherine, you need to come with me right now," he said breathlessly. "There's been trouble at the hotel, and it involves your friend Mr. Whitmore." Catherine's heart lurched as she looked down at Samuel, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib with the wooden horse tucked under his arm. "What kind of trouble? Is he hurt?" "Not hurt, but arrested," Dr. Harrison replied grimly. "Sheriff Coleman rode back into town an hour ago and found Jonathan Whitmore waiting for him. Apparently there's a warrant out for Whitmore's arrest, and it's connected to some very serious charges." Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The man who had saved Samuel's life, who had shown them such extraordinary kindness, was a wanted criminal. It seemed impossible, but the grim certainty in Dr. Harrison's voice left no room for doubt. "Mrs. Chen," she called downstairs, "could you please watch Samuel for a few minutes? There's an emergency I need to attend to." The elderly Chinese woman appeared at the bottom of the stairs, took one look at Catherine's stricken face, and nodded without asking questions. "Go. Little Samuel's safe with me." Catherine grabbed her shawl and followed Dr. Harrison through Silver Creek's main street, which was buzzing with excitement as townspeople gathered in small groups to discuss the shocking developments. As they approached the hotel, Catherine could see Sheriff Coleman's horse tied to the hitching post, and through the hotel's front windows, she glimpsed several men in what appeared to be an intense confrontation. "Dr. Harrison," she said, catching his arm before they entered the building, "what exactly is Jonathan accused of?" The doctor's expression grew even more troubled. "Bank robbery, cattle rustling, and murder. The warrant claims he's been operating under false identities throughout Colorado and Wyoming, stealing livestock and robbing banks to fund his criminal enterprises. There's apparently a $500 bounty on his head." Catherine stared at him in disbelief. The gentleman who had given a wooden horse to her sick child, who had spoken so tenderly about his own lost son, was supposedly a ruthless outlaw? Nothing about Jonathan's behavior or demeanor suggested criminal tendencies, but she had to admit that her experience with actual criminals was limited to the Garrett brothers who had killed Marcus. Inside the hotel lobby, they found a scene of controlled chaos. Sheriff Coleman, a weathered man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood near the front desk with his hand resting on his gun. Jonathan sat in a wooden chair near the window, his hands shackled behind his back, while two men Catherine didn't recognize flanked him like guards. "Ah, Dr. Harrison," Sheriff Coleman said as they entered. "Good timing. This gentleman claims you can vouch for his character and recent activities in Silver Creek." Jonathan looked up as Catherine and Dr. Harrison approached, and she was shocked by the change in his appearance. Gone was the confident, compassionate man she had come to know, replaced by someone who looked older, more weathered, and infinitely more dangerous. But when their eyes met, she still saw the same kindness that had prompted him to help her in her darkest hour. "Mrs. Wells," he said quietly, "I'm sorry you have to see this. I never intended for my past to complicate your life." "Your past?" Catherine asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Are these charges true?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "The man they're looking for is my brother," he said finally, "James Whitmore. We were twins, identical in appearance, and James has been using my name and reputation to cover his criminal activities for the past 3 years." Sheriff Coleman snorted with derision. "That's a convenient story, Whitmore. We've heard it before from men trying to avoid justice. You match the physical description perfectly. You're carrying papers with the name Jonathan Whitmore, and you've been spotted in 3 different territories where crimes bearing your signature have occurred." "What signature?" Catherine asked. Before she could stop herself, one of the men flanking Jonathan, a deputy with a star pinned to his leather vest, answered her question. "The Whitmore gang always leaves behind carved wooden tokens at their crime scenes. Little animals usually. Horses. It's their calling card, meant to taunt law enforcement and show how clever they think they are." Catherine felt her blood run cold as she remembered the beautiful wooden horse Jonathan had given to Samuel. the exquisite craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the obvious expense involved in its creation. Was it possible that the toy she had admired was actually evidence of criminal activity? "The wooden horse," she whispered, and saw Jonathan's face fall as he realized the direction of her thoughts. "Catherine, no," he said urgently. "That horse was a gift from my heart to your son. It has nothing to do with whatever crimes my brother may have committed." "Then why," Sheriff Coleman interjected, "were you carrying 5 more identical horses in your saddlebags when we searched your belongings? Are you telling us you plan to give expensive toys to every child in Silver Creek?" The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. 5 more wooden horses, identical to the one Samuel cherished, hidden in Jonathan's possessions like evidence of guilt. How could she have been so naive, so willing to believe in the goodness of a man she barely knew? Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his medical training apparently extending to detective work. "Sheriff, what specific evidence connects Mr. Whitmore to these crimes beyond physical resemblance and wooden toys?" "Plenty," Sheriff Coleman replied, pulling out a well-worn wanted poster and unfolding it for everyone to see. "Bank teller in Cheyenne identified him from this likeness after a robbery 3 weeks ago. Rancher outside Denver swore he sold cattle to this exact man just before his entire herd mysteriously disappeared. And a hotel clerk in Colorado Springs remembers him checking in under the name Jonathan Whitmore the night before their local bank was cleaned out." Catherine studied the wanted poster with growing dismay. The drawing did look remarkably like Jonathan, though she had to admit that Frontier wanted posters were notoriously unreliable when it came to accurate representations. But the accumulation of evidence was damning, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the man who had saved Samuel's life. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "is there anything you can tell us that would prove your innocence?" Jonathan looked at her with an expression of such profound sadness that Catherine felt her heart break a little. "I can tell you that I've spent the last 3 years trying to track down my brother and clear my name," he said. "I can tell you that every crime attributed to me was actually committed by James, who has been trading on our identical appearance and my previously spotless reputation. But I can't prove it because James is clever enough to stay 1 step ahead of both the law and me." "Where is this brother now?" Sheriff Coleman demanded. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "That's why I came to Silver Creek. I had information suggesting he might be operating in this area, using local connections to plan his next robbery. But so far, I haven't found any trace of him." The deputy who'd been silent during most of the conversation suddenly spoke up. "Sheriff, there's something else you should know. We found this in his hotel room." He held up a hand-drawn map of Silver Creek with various buildings marked and what appeared to be timing notations written in the margins. The bank was circled in red ink, and there were detailed notes about guard schedules, safe locations, and escape routes. Catherine stared at the map in horror. It looked exactly like the kind of planning document a bank robber would create, complete with contingency plans and careful observations about local law enforcement patterns. Combined with the other evidence, it painted a picture of a man who had come to Silver Creek not to help a desperate widow, but to case their bank for his next criminal enterprise. "This isn't what it looks like," Jonathan said desperately. "I was trying to figure out where James might strike next. I've been tracking his pattern of operations, and Silver Creek fits his typical target profile perfectly. The map was my attempt to think like him, to anticipate his moves." "A very convenient explanation," Sheriff Coleman replied dryly. "One that conveniently places you at the scene of your brother's supposed crimes with detailed knowledge of local security arrangements." Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes as the weight of the evidence overwhelmed her desire to believe in Jonathan's innocence. The man who had given her $25 without asking for anything in return, who had brought a toy for her sick child, who had spoken so movingly about his own family's tragedy, Was he really an elaborate fraud designed to gain her trust for some ulterior purpose? The money, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, the $25 you gave me for Samuel's medicine, where did that come from? Jonathan's face went white as he realized the implications of her question. Catherine, please! You can't possibly think that I would use stolen money to buy medicine for a sick child. But where did it come from? She pressed, her voice growing stronger as her anger began to replace her confusion. You gave me $25, like it was nothing, like you had so much money that it didn't matter. What kind of honest business obeys that well? I own cattle ranches, Jonathan insisted, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. Legitimate cattle ranches that have been in my family for 2 generations. Sheriff Coleman consulted another document from his collection of evidence. Funny thing about that, Whitmore. We checked with the Territorial Land Office, and there's no record of any Jonathan Whitmore owning ranch property in Colorado, Wyoming, or Montana. Either you're lying about your business interests, or you're operating under a false identity. The revelation was the final blow to Catherine's faith in Jonathan's innocence. Everything he had told her about his background, his wealth, his reasons for being in Silver Creek, all of it could be lies designed to cover his criminal activities. She thought about Samuel upstairs, sleeping peacefully with a toy that might be a trophy from some terrible crime, and felt sick to her stomach. I trusted you, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. I believed everything you told me, and you made me feel like there were still good people in the world. Was any of it real? All of it was real, Jonathan replied urgently. My feelings for you and Samuel, my desire to help, my grief over losing my family, none of that was a lie. Catherine, please, I know how this looks, but I swear to you that I'm not the man they're looking for. But Catherine was beyond listening to more explanations that might turn out to be more lies. She turned to Sheriff Coleman with a resolute expression that surprised everyone present, including herself. Sheriff, I want to return the money he gave me, she said firmly. If it came from criminal activities, I don't want any part of it. And I want to return the toy he gave to my son. Catherine, no, Jonathan pleaded. Samuel needs that medicine. Please don't let my troubles interfere with his recovery. I'll find another way to pay for his treatment, Catherine replied, though she had no idea how she would manage such a thing. I won't have my son's life saved with blood money. Dr. Harrison put a gentle hand on her shoulder. Catherine, let's not make any hasty decisions. Regardless of where the money came from, Samuel is responding well to the medicine. Stopping his treatment now could be dangerous. But Catherine's mind was made up. She had been prepared to sacrifice her dignity to save Samuel's life. But she would not accept help from a criminal, no matter how desperate her circumstances. Some compromises were too great to make, even for a mother's love. Sheriff Coleman, she said with quiet dignity, I'll cooperate fully with your investigation. If Mr. Whitmore used my situation to establish credibility for some criminal purpose, I want to help you prove it. Jonathan looked at her with an expression of such profound devastation that Catherine almost wavered in her resolve. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and she could no longer afford to trust her emotions over cold facts. As Sheriff Coleman prepared to transport his prisoner to the territorial capital for trial, Catherine took one last look at the man who had briefly represented hope and kindness in her dark world. Whether he was guilty or innocent, their connection was over, and she would have to find the strength to continue her fight for survival without him. The crowd outside the hotel had grown larger as word of the arrest spread through Silver Creek, and Catherine could hear her name being whispered as people speculated about her involvement with the notorious outlaw. Her reputation, already damaged by Marcus's death and her subsequent poverty, would now be further tainted by association with criminal activity. But as she walked back toward the general store where Samuel waited for her, Catherine realized that She had learned something valuable from this devastating experience. She was stronger than she had thought, capable of making difficult moral choices even when they worked against her immediate interests. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity that no amount of desperation could take away from her. The medicine ran out on Saturday morning, just as Samuel's breathing began to deteriorate again. Catherine stared at the empty bottles on her small table, panic rising in her throat as she realized the full consequences of her decision to reject Jonathan's money. Without funds for additional treatment, her son would slide back into the same life-threatening condition that had nearly killed him before. Dr. Harrison arrived for his morning check and immediately noticed Samuel's regression. The child's fever had returned with a vengeance. His breathing was labored once more, and the healthy color that had briefly returned to his cheeks was fading back to the sickly pallor that had terrified Catherine for weeks. The medicine was working, Dr. Harrison said grimly as he examined Samuel with practiced hands. But pneumonia in children often requires multiple rounds of treatment. We need another shipment from Denver immediately. How much? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Another $25, possibly more if we need the stronger formulation. Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle, but firm. Catherine, I understand your principles about the money, but Samuel's life is hanging in the balance again. Catherine walked to the window and looked down at Silver Creek's main street, where normal life continued despite her personal crisis. People went about their business, unaware that a child was dying one floor above their daily routines. She had exactly 73 cents to her name, having returned Jonathan's $25 to Sheriff Coleman before his departure. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Someone in this town must be willing to help a sick child. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine knew they were false hope. The same people who had abandoned her after Marcus's death were unlikely to suddenly develop charitable impulses, especially now that her association with a suspected criminal had further damaged her reputation. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, having climbed the stairs with unusual urgency. Her normally serene expression was troubled, and she carried a folded piece of paper that trembled in her weathered hands. Mrs. Wells, she said carefully, bad news come to store. You need to see this. The paper was an official notice from the Territorial Land Office, written in the formal language of legal documents, but simple enough in its meaning. Chen's General Store had been sold to new owners who were exercising their right to terminate all existing rental agreements. Catherine and Samuel had 1 week to vacate the premises. But why? Catherine asked, reading the notice again, as if the words might change. We've paid our rent on time. We haven't caused any problems. Mrs. Chen's expression grew even more troubled. New owners, they hear about trouble with wanted man. They say, store need. How you say, better reputation. No want widow who makes scandal with criminals. The cruelty of the situation struck Catherine like a physical blow. Not only was Samuel's health failing again, but they were about to lose their shelter. Because of her association with Jonathan, in a week, they would be homeless in the approaching Montana winter with a sick child and no money for medicine or food. Mrs. Chen, Catherine said urgently, is there any way to change their minds? Could I speak with the new owners directly? The elderly woman shook her head sadly. New owners, they come from Helena, rich men who buy many properties in Silver Creek. They no care about one widow and sick baby. They only care about money and reputation. Dr. Harrison had been listening to this exchange with growing anger. This is unconscionable, he said firmly. A child's life is at stake, and they're worried about reputation. What kind of Christians throw a sick baby into the street? The "Unkind, who value appearance over compassion," Catherine replied bitterly. "The same kind who abandoned me after Marcus died, who refused to help when Samuel first got sick, who now use my desperation against me." A commotion outside drew their attention. To the window, where they could see a crowd gathering around two men on horseback who had just arrived in town. Even from a distance, Catherine could tell that one of the riders looked remarkably similar to Jonathan, and her heart began racing with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it be his brother? Dr. Harrison wondered aloud. The twin he claimed was responsible for the crimes. They watched as the riders dismounted and entered Murphy's saloon, followed by several curious townspeople eager to see if this new arrival matched the description of the wanted criminal. Within minutes, excited voices could be heard from the street as word spread that Jonathan Whitmore's supposed twin brother had arrived in Silver Creek. Catherine felt torn between her desire to see if this development might vindicate Jonathan and her responsibility to Samuel, who was growing sicker by the hour. But Mrs. Chen settled the matter by volunteering to watch the child while Catherine and Dr. Harrison investigated the situation. Murphy's saloon was packed with spectators when they arrived, all straining to get a look at the man who might hold the key to Jonathan's innocence or guilt. Catherine pushed through the crowd and found herself staring at someone who was indeed virtually identical to Jonathan in appearance, but completely different in manner and bearing, where Jonathan had carried himself with quiet dignity and spoke. With gentle consideration, this man radiated arrogance and barely contained violence. His clothes were expensive but dirty, his gun was worn for quick access rather than protection, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other people as obstacles or opportunities rather than fellow human beings. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced in a voice that was Jonathan's but somehow twisted, "I understand there's been some confusion about my identity. Allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm James Whitmore, and I'm here to set the record straight about my dear brother Jonathan." A murmur ran through the crowd as people realized they were finally seeing the mysterious twin whose existence Jonathan had claimed as his defense, but Catherine noticed that Frank Morrison, the merchant who had been in the saloon the night she met Jonathan, was studying James with intense scrutiny. "You're lying," Frank said suddenly, his voice cutting through the crowd's whispers. "I've seen both of you now, and Jonathan Whitmore was a gentleman. You're something else entirely." James's expression hardened as he fixed his attention on Frank. "Are you calling me a liar, storekeeper?" "I'm saying that Jonathan Whitmore gave money to help a sick child without asking for anything in return," Frank replied courageously. "What have you ever given anyone except trouble?" The tension in the saloon became palpable as James's hand moved closer to his gun. Catherine realized that Frank Morrison was risking his life to defend Jonathan's character, and she felt ashamed that she had doubted the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "James Whitmore," Dr. Harrison said loudly, "if you're really Jonathan's brother, then you can help us clear up this misunderstanding. Where were you 3 weeks ago when the Cheyenne Bank was robbed?" James smiled coldly. "Depends on who's asking, and why they want to know. I'm asking because an innocent man is sitting in a territorial jail because of crimes you committed," Dr. Harrison replied. "If you have any decency at all, you'll confess to Sheriff Coleman and clear your brother's name." "My brother," James said with contempt, "always was too soft for the real world. Maybe a few years in prison will toughen him up." The callousness of his response confirmed Catherine's growing certainty that Jonathan had been telling the truth about his twin's criminal activities. But before she could speak, James noticed her in the crowd, and his expression changed to one of predatory interest. "Well, well," he said, approaching her with the confidence of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. "You must be the famous widow who's been keeping my brother company. I can see why he was so eager to help you out." Catherine instinctively stepped back, but James continued advancing until Dr. Harrison positioned himself between them. "The lady is not interested in your attention," the doctor said firmly. "Isn't she?" James replied with a laugh that held no humor. "From what I hear, she was plenty interested in making deals with strange men. Maybe she'd like to make a deal. With me, too." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and Catherine felt every eye in the saloon turn to her. James had reduced her desperate attempt to save Samuel's life to something sordid and shameful, using her vulnerability as a weapon against her. But instead of the shame and humiliation she might have felt weeks earlier, Catherine discovered something else inside herself, a core of steel that poverty and desperation had forged but not broken. She stepped around Dr. Harrison and faced James directly, her voice clear and strong. "The only deal I'm interested in making," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is seeing you confess to the crimes that put your innocent brother in jail. Whatever else you think you know about me, you're wrong. I'm not the desperate woman I was a week ago." James's expression darkened at her defiance, and Catherine realized she had made a dangerous enemy. But she also realized that she no longer cared. Samuel was dying, they were about to be evicted, and winter was coming. James Whitmore's threats seemed insignificant compared to the battles she was already fighting. "We'll see about that," James said quietly, and Catherine knew that her troubles with the Whitmore brothers were far from over. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Silver Creek in the form of a federal marshal accompanied by 3 territorial deputies. Catherine watched from her window above the general store as the lawmen dismounted in front of Murphy's saloon, their official badges glinting in the early sunlight. Word spread quickly through the town that James Whitmore's arrival had triggered a larger investigation into the string of robberies that had terrorized the territory. Marshal William Hayes was a tall, serious man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent tracking criminals across difficult terrain. He wasted no time in establishing his authority, posting deputies at strategic locations around town and sending word that he wanted to speak with everyone who had encountered either of the Whitmore brothers. Catherine was feeding Samuel his morning and porridge when Mrs. Chen climbed the stairs to inform her that the marshal wanted to interview her about her interactions with Jonathan. Samuel was noticeably weaker than he had been the previous day, his breathing labored and his fever climbing steadily without the medicine that had briefly restored his health. "Mrs. Wells," Marshal Hayes said when she met him in the hotel lobby, "I understand you had extensive contact with the man calling himself Jonathan Whitmore. I need you to tell me everything about your interactions with him, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Catherine recounted her story carefully, from her desperate visit to Murphy's saloon through Jonathan's unexpected generosity and their subsequent conversations. She described his gentleness with Samuel, his grief over his own lost family, and the kindness he had shown during her darkest hour. "And you believed his story about having a twin brother?" Marshal Hayes asked when she finished. "At first, no," Catherine admitted. "The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. But after seeing James yesterday, I'm convinced Jonathan was telling the truth. They may look identical, but they're completely different men." Marshal Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "We've been tracking the real criminal for over a year. James Whitmore has been using his brother's identity and reputation to avoid suspicion, while Jonathan has been following behind him, trying to clear his name. Unfortunately, Jonathan's pursuit of his brother has often placed him at or near crime scenes, making him look guilty." "So Jonathan really is innocent?" Catherine asked, hope beginning to bloom in her chest. "As innocent as a man can be," Marshal Hayes confirmed. James confessed to everything last night when we cornered him at his camp outside town. Apparently, he'd been planning to rob Silver Creek's bank this week, which explains the map we found in Jonathan's room. Jonathan had figured out his brother's target and was trying to warn local authorities. The relief Catherine felt at this news was overwhelming, but it was immediately tempered by the reality of her current situation. Jonathan's innocence didn't change the fact that Samuel was dying, that they faced eviction in 5 days, or that she had no money for medicine or food. "Marshal," she said hesitantly, "will Jonathan be released now that his brother has confessed?" "He's already on his way back to Silver Creek," Marshal Hayes replied. "Should arrive this afternoon. I imagine he'll want to see you, considering everything you've been through because of this mix-up." After the marshal left, Catherine returned to their room to find Samuel's condition had worsened significantly. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and rapid, and he barely responded when she spoke to him. Dr. Harrison arrived for his daily visit and immediately assessed the gravity of the situation. "We need that medicine today," he said, "urgently." "I don't think Samuel can wait much longer." Catherine stared down at her son, feeling helpless rage at the circumstances that kept her from saving him. She had money once, had medicine once, had hope once. Now she had nothing but 24 cents, and the knowledge that Jonathan's innocence wouldn't bring back the resources she had rejected in her moment of doubt. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention to the window, where she saw Jonathan dismounting from a territorial deputy's horse in front of the hotel. Even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion and strain of his ordeal in the way he moved, but there was also something else, a sense of relief at finally being vindicated after months of pursuit and false accusations. Jonathan looked up, toward the general store, as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the dusty street. Catherine felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over her, relief at his innocence, shame at her doubt, and desperate hope that somehow his return might offer salvation for Samuel. Within minutes, Jonathan was climbing the stairs to their room, moving with the urgent purpose of a man who had something important to accomplish. He knocked softly on their door, and when Catherine opened it, she was struck by how much older he looked after just a few days in territorial custody. "Catherine," he said simply, "I heard about Samuel. How is he?" "Dying," she replied honestly, stepping aside to let him enter. "The medicine ran out yesterday, and I don't have money for more." Jonathan moved immediately to Samuel's crib, studying the child's condition with the practiced eye of someone who had watched his own son fight a similar battle. Samuel's breathing was so labored that Catherine could see his tiny chest struggling with each inhalation, and his fever had climbed high enough to make him delirious. "Dr. Harrison," Jonathan said to the physician who had been quietly observing this reunion, "what does Samuel need?" "Another round of medicine from Denver, possibly 2 rounds, Dr. Harrison replied. $50 minimum, and that's assuming we can get emergency delivery." Without hesitation, Jonathan reached into his vest and withdrew a leather wallet that Catherine recognized from their first meeting. "Whatever it costs," he said, counting out bills. "Wire Denver immediately and tell them it's a medical emergency. I'll pay any express charges necessary to get that medicine here by tomorrow." "Jonathan." "No," Catherine protested. "I can't accept more money from you. I already rejected your help once, and I have no way to repay you." "You rejected money you thought came from criminal activities," Jonathan replied gently. "This money comes from legitimate cattle ranching, just as I told you originally. And as for repayment, seeing Samuel recover will be payment enough." Dr. Harrison accepted the money and immediately prepared to send the emergency telegram to Denver. "If we're lucky, the medicine will arrive on tomorrow's stage. If we're very lucky, they might send it by special courier tonight." After Dr. Harrison left, Catherine and Jonathan sat in awkward silence, broken only by Samuel's labored breathing. There was so much to say, apologies to make, explanations to give, trust to rebuild, but the words seemed inadequate for everything they had both endured. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Catherine said finally. "The evidence seemed so convincing, and I was so afraid of what it meant for Samuel." "You did what any responsible mother would do," Jonathan replied. "I don't blame you for protecting your son, even from me, but I should have trusted my instincts," Catherine insisted. "Everything about you showed kindness and decency. I should have believed in that instead of circumstantial evidence." Jonathan reached over and gently touched Samuel's fevered forehead. "Trust has to be earned, Catherine. I hadn't done enough to earn yours yet. But maybe now we can start over. Build something real based on truth instead of desperation." The medicine arrived that evening by special courier, a grueling ride from Denver that cost Jonathan an additional $50 in express fees. Dr. Harrison administered the first dose immediately, and by midnight, Samuel's breathing had begun to ease slightly. Over the next 3 days, as Samuel's recovery progressed steadily, Catherine and Jonathan spent long hours talking about everything that had brought them to this point. She learned about his 3-year quest to clear his name, his grief over losing his family, and his determination to make something positive from his suffering. He learned about her journey from respected sheriff's wife to desperate widow, her strength in the face of impossible choices, and her fierce love for her son. When the eviction notice deadline arrived, Jonathan had a solution for that too. He purchased the general store building from the new owners at a price they couldn't refuse, then asked Catherine if she would consider managing it for him while he established a legitimate cattle ranch outside Silver Creek. "It's not charity," he insisted when she hesitated. "It's business. I need someone I trust to run the store, and you need a stable income and a place to live. Samuel needs a safe environment to grow up in, and I need a family again if you'll have me." Catherine looked around the store that would become truly theirs. Then at Samuel playing happily with his wooden horse, finally restored to full health. The child who had nearly died was now laughing and babbling, his crisis behind him and his future bright with possibility. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I think we all need a family again." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, in 1888, Catherine Wells became Catherine Whitmore in a simple ceremony at Silver Creek's wooden church. Samuel, now a robust and healthy toddler, served as ring-bearer, clutching the wooden horse that had become his most treasured possession. The town that had once abandoned Catherine in her hour of need now celebrated her happiness, perhaps recognizing that they had witnessed something rare and precious, the power of genuine love to triumph over desperation, her doubt, and the cruel circumstances that could break lesser spirits. As Catherine and Jonathan exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges might come, Samuel clapped his hands in delight, surrounded by a community that had learned something valuable about the difference between reputation and character, between judgment and mercy. Sometimes the worst moments in life became the foundation for the best ones, and sometimes the people who appeared, when everything seemed lost, were exactly the people fate intended to find. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.